Hi, this is the SOFTRAX audio blog for the week of November 5th, 2018. My name is Graham Hulme, and I'm the Vice President of Product Management at SOFTRAX. In last week's audio blog, we discussed the standalone selling price concept of ASC 606 and how it's a requirement to meet step number 4 in ASC 606, which is allocate the transaction price to performance obligations. As part of that, we discussed the definition of a standalone selling price. We discussed how to, the hierarchy, so to speak, of determining a standalone selling price for each performance obligation in a contract in terms of using observable evidence all the way through estimating if observable pricing isn't available. So we went through those discussion topics, and we discussed, the estimation approaches that the guidance puts forward as possible approaches in terms of the adjusted market assessment and cost plus margin approaches, respectively. Today's audio blog will focus on an approach that really is the last stop on the standalone selling price train, which is called the residual approach. And so under ASC 606-32-34C, an entity may use the residual approach in estimating the standalone selling price by reference to the total transaction price less the sum of the observable standalone selling price of other goods or services promised in the contract. An entity may use a residual approach to estimate, in accordance with paragraph 606-10-32-33, the standalone selling price of a good or service only if one of the following criteria is met. The first piece of criteria is the entity sells the same good or service to different customers at or near the same time for a broad range of amounts. That is, the selling price is highly variable because a representative standalone selling price is not discernible from past transactions or other observable evidence. The second piece of criteria is the entity has not yet established a price for that good or service, and their good or service has not previously been sold on a standalone basis. That is, the selling price is uncertain. So stated another way for clarity, the residual approach effectively allows an entity that has observable standalone selling prices for one or more of the performance obligations in a contract to allocate the remaining transaction price to the goods or services that do not have observable standalone selling prices in the contract. And so, to be clear, the residual approach is effectively you could call it a safety net. I call it the last stop or last rung on the ladder, whatever I guess term you'd like to use, but it's the last estimation approach that a company can take if it's gone through the other approaches and deem those as inappropriate or not applicable to what they're selling in their contracts. And so as a result, it's important that a company that they do a thorough analysis as to why the residual approach is most appropriate for them. So if you marry this up to what the SEC has put forward in comment letters, I cherry-picked 2 comments the SEC put forward to companies on the residual approach that stood out. So the first comment is, quote, "You indicate that you use the residual approach to estimate the standalone selling price for your software licenses since the same products are sold to different customers at a broad range of prices, which are highly variable. Please provide a comprehensive quantitative discussion of such variability to support your conclusion," end quote. The second comment is very similar. Quote, "You indicate that the selling price of your software licenses is highly variable, and therefore you estimate the standalone selling price using the residual method. Please provide a comprehensive quantitative discussion of such variability to support your conclusion," end quote. So those were comments to 2 different companies in 2 different SEC comment letters, and they show that the burden of proof is on companies to justify the use of the residual approach. So, one of the things we want to cover today is, all right, what are the considerations and actions, steps, what have you, that companies can proactively take when they're assessing, analyzing, and then ultimately selecting the use of the residual approach. And then obviously they have to explain it both qualitatively and quantitatively. What are some best practices that could be used? So, In reviewing companies' filings where they did get SEC comment letters, looking at the responses those companies gave to those comment letters, and then looking at companies that used the residual method and did not get comment letters, we assembled what in my view is a set of steps that companies can use to really comprehensively explain and to the readers of their financial statements why the residual approach was most appropriate. So let's start with, they should really provide an explanation of the details of the products and services they offer. Pretty straightforward, but has to be said. Leave no ambiguity on what the products and services represent that a company is offering. The next piece is detail whether these products or services are bundled, and if they are bundled, explain all of the key, what, how, when, why, etc. Information, and also explain for those bundles, are they customer or contract specific, or are those bundles effectively repeatable and standard, so to speak, that go across, different customers' contracts. So, additionally, it's important to point out that explaining how the products are sold is also important. Are these direct sales, or are they sold via channels such as resellers, distributors, partners, etc.? Another key practice that should be taken into account is the factor that should be considered is that, are there any key contract specific considerations that affect the pricing, such as the number of transaction volumes in a contract, the length of the contract, the customer type, the customer size, the customer location, the customer credit history. If there's anything that's contract or customer specific that impacts the pricing, that should be part of the discussion when obviously evaluating and ultimately selecting the residual approach. The other piece is to identify whether any products or services have SSP, using an approach other than the residual method, and then pointing out the ones that you did use the residual method to determine SSP. I think it's important to explain in the companies that have not gotten comment letters, they've been clear on why certain products and services in the contract had observable pricing, had an ability to estimate using methods other than the residual approach, whereas, and then they explained, all right, but for these products and services in the contract, the residual approach is most applicable, and why. So having that juxtaposition is important. I think in doing that, it's important to explain, for the possible estimation approaches put forward in the guidance, why neither why neither made sense. And so, for the adjusted market assessment approach, companies identified factors such as whether there were representative comparisons to competitors' products or not. For example, is the product or service that the company offers so unique that there is no apples-to-apples comparison to a competitor's product? That was the type of information that they put forward to really rule in or rule out whether the adjusted market assessment approach was applicable. For the cost plus margin approach, it was the keys that were identified were whether there was direct observable costs that could be aligned with the products or services being provided, and also pointing out that whether the company uses those costs to make pricing decisions. On the margin front, the considerations included things like, were there rapid changes in technologies offered in the market? Were there changes in the customer's spending behavior or patterns? Is the company dealing with competitors that are much larger, that have an ability to have great flexibility on pricing and margins that they simply don't? And then the fourth thing is, is there a macroeconomic change or any change beyond the company's control? Those are all key things that should be factored into the cost plus margin assessment. So after explaining qualitatively those key, best practice or discussion points in terms of explaining the assessment and decision-making process that led to the residual approach being used, another best practice is to marry those qualitative points with quantitative data points so that it's clear, okay, here are metrics to justify our selection. So what companies typically did is they took their, representative transaction sets for given periods of time, and they used data points like the minimum discount percentage, the maximum discount percentage, the median selling price as a percent of the list price, the high selling price as a percent of list price, the low selling price as the percent of list price. They used that information as a basis to identify any variability in pricing that would justify the selection of the residual approach. And again, these are just examples. It's important for a company to choose data points and quantitative metrics that are most relevant to their products, their services, their pricing, their customers, etc. So as you can see, while using the residual approach might make sense, there has to be a good and a thorough checklist that companies go through and they need to take credit for that work and explain it clearly when they provide financial statements. I think in summary, it's clear that the obviously the standalone selling price requirements in terms of how you achieve a standalone selling price, how you estimate it, and it's one of the areas in 606 that introduces tactical and strategic challenges, right? And we've covered that both in this audio blog and the last one. I think similar to other areas of 606, the ultimate goal for companies is to move to a state of complete or almost complete automation. It's not a one-step process. It's likely going to be a phased approach to reach full automation. So the key is that companies need a plan to move from what may be a heavy person-driven manual approach to more of an automated approach. And so the standalone selling price requirements, the allocation requirements, the residual approach, the adjusted market assessment approach, the cost plus margin approach, these are all areas that are ripe for automation. And so, as companies, tackle these complex accounting requirements like, 606, the leasing standard, et cetera, it's important that they keep a focus on moving the back office to an automated state because it can help with these types of requirements. So when your company's time comes, SOFTRAX, we provide products and services that can help plan and execute a company's progression to automation. And so, we'd love to hear from you when that time comes. That's it for today. Please go to SOFTRAX.com and RevenueRecognition.com for more content in the form of audio and written blogs, webinars, etc. Thank you for your time today, and we'll talk to you next time.